Okay, this session I'm working on PoorMansAnubis. My previous recording, I worked on having the non-libcurl code path return response with chunked encoding. This session, I'm working with libcurl to do the same. So with PoorMansAnubis C++ build, there's a flag which is -- enable -libcurl. And what that does is it uses libcurl internally to process requests. For this use case of where maybe your remote is HTTPS instead of just HTTP, the default settings can't handle HTTPS, but curl can handle that, which is the purpose of the usage of libcurl in the program, to be able to query a remote server over HTTPS. So just like the other day's session, the function that handles the request and response to and from the remote is its own function, and in this case it's called do_curl forwarding. And just like the previous day's function, it has a bunch of arguments that can be simplified when I pass it the thread data struct instead. So the strategy for this function, just like the other day's function, to respond to the client during the curl handling of the response from the remote. I get kind of sidetracked and do some implementation of the handling of the body of the response early. So I was thinking I would just handle writing the data and not do the data count before, but I decided against it and just figure might as well do the data count right now. As a reminder, chunked encoding is an encoding where when a response data is sent from the server, it sends a number in hexadecimal, then a carriage return in new line, and then data that is the size of the number sent earlier, and then a carriage return new line. This repeats until the server sends a 0 and then the double of carriage return in new line. So that error condition is very unlikely to happen. But when you're programming, you should account for every possible path the code can take. So if return value is less than 0 from that write, that SN which is very unlikely because there's enough room for, well, 64 bits of, well, then the number in base 10 wouldn't be longer than 32 bytes, I would think. The numerical representation, that is. Note that one character is 1 byte. So since there can be about 20 digits in base 10 for UN64, that's about 20 characters or 20 bytes, and 32 is enough for that. Here I'm also doing a bunch of non-blocking I/O stuff, as I usually set non-blocking I/O on every socket. Curl stuff does its own thing, but I still have a file descriptor to the client that initiated the request to PoorMansAnubis. So that socket is non-blocking I/O, because I set it that way when I accepted the connection from the client. Again, I'm also handling if write returns 0. I previously thought that it meant end of file, but now I'm not so sure. But just in case it happens, I'm still handling it. Notice I don't have an else after all that. This is because every if statement and else if ends with a return or go to. And there's a guarantee that if all the else's, if all the if statements are false in their condition, you know that by the time it passes it, that condition is checking for is false. So for example, the first if is write red less than 0. If it passes that, then you know for sure that write red is not negative. And it passes write red equals 0. And then in the last one, it passes that it fully wrote all the bytes. After all those if else statements, if you're in the code path after all that, then it's a guarantee that you wrote everything successfully. Because otherwise, it would have followed one of the if statements blocks and either returned or went to go to back to the right. So the compiler thinks I'm trying to append to a C string when I'm actually trying to index into the C string. So a quick fix for that is just to cast it, because a C string is basically an array type. I think under the hood, casting it to a pointer type allows me to index it by adding a value. Or allows me to index it, such as indexing by adding a value. Sorry. I just noticed there's some weird formatting with those lines, but Clang format isn't fixing it, and I'm not sure if I should fix it because it would mess with Git history of the lines. I guess if I need to make changes, I'll make the change then. So these lines appending header information isn't necessary, because I could just do that when libcurl calls uses a callback for each header. And then there's this one line here where the compiler thinks I'm trying to add to the string array, C string. So this is technically editing code for an unrelated part of what I'm trying to do right now, other than it was code from the other day, but I still decided to fix it because of the compiler warning. So I'm double checking some of the curl options I set. You don't see it because asciinema only records the terminal, but I have the libcurl API page open on a browser on a separate window. So I make a function to handle headers, but I forget about that function because there already exists a function that's handling headers. Oops, I guess, but I fixed it eventually by removing that unused function. So the previous implementation of this callback is parsing every header and storing it. The new implementation is just going to forward everything to the client. libcurl provides the headers and the status line and the ending line with the carriage return new line, I think, before the body of the response. Also, if you've been paying attention, there's something I do wrong with this header callback that causes a bug. I'll let you know when I fix it, but right now, there is a potential bug that I forget to fix. And it has something to do with this callback. Not necessarily within the callback itself. Maybe I said too much, but yeah. So the H key in Vim is left, and the I key is switched from normal mode to input mode, or insert mode. But I was already in insert mode, so I typed left and insert, and it came out as H and I. Like Vim is saying hi to me. I don't know. Yeah, the Vim shortcuts, the H, J, K, L characters are left, up, down, right, I think. I might have gotten the up and down mixed up sometimes, but yeah. It's faster to use the directional shortcuts, that is HJKL, than to move your hand to the arrow keys. 4 alphabetical letters designated just for movement, and you don't have to move your right hand to do it. I think it's the same in Helix Editor. This is NeoVim, by the way. So I'm trying to write the header buffer, and it's not null terminated. Well, I'm looking up the syntax for the format, usually passed to std : format, introduced in a relatively new version of C++. I think maybe 21 or 23. Something like that. C++ 19, maybe? I don't remember. Is there 19? I have to look at the version numbers again, but yeah. Again, because I handled write is negative and write equals 0, by the time this if statement is reached, it is guaranteed that write is not negative and it is not 0. Otherwise, it would have branched into those blocks. But because it passed those if checks, the guarantee is that it's greater than 0 at the last else if. First of all, this is the wrong place to add new flags, because it's the wrong struct. It's not the thread data struct, it's the add report info struct. Second of all, in the end, I end up not needing to use a flag, I think. If I do use one, then I forgot, but I think I don't need to use a flag by the end of this. So this ends up not being necessary because later find out that libcurl gives you the ending line when it gets called, when the callback gets called by libcurl for the headers. So this wasn't necessary. I get rid of this later. So here I'm filtering out headers that I don't want to pass to the client. The creation of a C++ string only aids in checking the line given to this callback. There's a better way for me to write the transfer encoding chunked header than to check for a flag. I do that eventually. I'll mention it when it happens. So, by looking around about libcurl, I find out that the last header isn't a header, but just the end line, which is a character return a new line. When this is passed to my callback, I know for certain it's the end of all the headers. So, in the past 5 seconds, you may have spotted the bug that I mentioned earlier. Maybe I'm giving too many hints, but it gets pretty obvious in hindsight. Through 4 is a response code that is sent with an empty body when the client requests information, but the server decides that it's up to date. Like the client can send a header asking for data valid by a certain timestamp, and if the server determines that it's still valid, it returns 304. You can look it up, HTTP 304. Long story short, it helps with caching of site data. If the client asks the server if the data is valid as of this timestamp. I try to handle it by try to handle 304 by fetching the response code of the request. But the way curl works, compared to my non-curl implementation, it's a bit different. libcurl is not going to call that body callback of the response body if it returned to 304. So I don't need to explicitly check for 304 right now. I realized that after I finished writing this bunch of when I finished writing this block of code. So I realized I could just put the ending line regardless of the status code, because I also need to do it for the regular responses as well. So at long last, I've reached a point where I think there's enough implementation to test. And I mentioned this one bug, so that'll pop up as I run this. Okay, one more hint. I don't have anything printing the headers in the code itself. And the libcurl usage path is not a debug build. There shouldn't be anything printing the headers. This is related to the bug I mentioned. In my attempt to fix this, I thought maybe adding the end new line for content wasn't part of the chunk encoding, but I have to fix this by uncommenting this later. So I'm testing with the browser and testing with curl, and it takes a while for me to figure it out myself. This is the bug. The data pointer I was handing to the header callback was not the thread data struct pointer. It was a pointer to an unordered map that wasn't used for anything. Somehow Valgrind didn't check this because the usage of the other pointer did not leave the allocated data. If there was an invalid write, Valgrind would have picked it up. But apparently an unordered map structure is big enough to have the same address offset as the connection file descriptor in the thread data pointer struct. So this other bug I'm running into now, malformed encoding found in chunked encoding, that's because I commented out the end line for the data for the response body. But I commented out in the midst of trying to fix the first bug. So annoyingly, that also takes a while for me to figure out. Luckily, I was using Wireshark, and it showed me that the data body did not have an ending end line, which is a carriage return new line. So by commenting out the part where it ends the body with the carriage return new line, it breaks this chunked encoding for the client, sending it to the client. Also, that first bug, I was mentioning that there was output of headers when I didn't mean to output a header. Following along that line of reasoning, if the thread data pointer was invalid, where is it getting the file descriptor from? Turns out if you write to file descriptor 0, it prints the standard output, or standard error. Either way, that was why I was getting output of headers on the terminal, because it conveniently landed on 0, most likely, when it dereferenced the pointer and accessed the file descriptor location in an unordered map instead of a thread data struct. So this is expected. If I'm streaming data, it's going to if you close the stream, the PoorMansAnubis side of the transfer gets closed. So this error is inevitable if I don't handle the file descriptor properly. It kind of is PoorMansAnubis' fault. It's just that it needs to handle the client closing the connection. For now, I think I leave it in, because streaming is some kind of a edge case, use case. I think I leave it in, but I'm not sure. So at this point, I'm basically done with the implementation using libcurl. And so I do a git commit and git push pretty soon. So that's basically it. I hope that was interesting, and thanks for watching.